Merry Christmas. We're in what we call the prequel, which is mostly Luke. That Luke gives us that wonderful story of the things that happened long before Jesus broke on the scene to be our Savior and to do his ministry. So this is back when Mary is about the only one who can tell Luke the story. Why? Well, because this has been 30 to 40 years. And Mary would be in her 70s. Joseph apparently is long gone. And so Luke would have sat down and talked with her, and she would have told him this wonderful, wonderful story. And of course, it's the story that we tell every Christmas. In the days of Caesar Augustus, a decree went out that all the world should be taxed. We all know how that goes. It's a beautiful story. And that makes it hard to teach because you've all heard it before. We've done it many times. But I'd like to just pick out some things we're going to talk about as we go through the Christmas story. And then we'll wind up with Jesus at the age of 12 at the temple. And then next week, we can begin some 20 years later with his ministry. One other thing to remember is that everybody else that you might think Luke could have interviewed, all of the apostles, they were babies at this time. They didn't know anything about this. That's why the story becomes so precious, because it's just Mary could give it to Luke. And it is one of the most beautiful stories in the world. And we can't do it justice, but we'll get some things out of it. Last week, we talked about Mary and Joseph making a 75-mile journey all the way down to Bethlehem to register with the Roman authorities. And, I read these things and then I ask questions about where'd they stay? Where did they stay? I mean, they're not going to camp out. She's in her, close to term, and had a rough day riding on a donkey if they had one, and he's walking. Maybe they make 10 miles a day. We're talking 10 nights they had to stay somewhere. Maybe there were some relatives and friends along the way. That's normally how you did it. The inns, as they are called, caravanserais, they were too rough for a little family like this. So where'd they stay? Well, there's an ancient tradition of hospitality in the Middle East that's very, very important. It's a beautiful story about it, if you ever get a chance to read it, in Judges 19, where an Ephraimite comes into a town, and he sits down in the city square right in the middle of the town, and nothing, no place to stay. And so as time goes on, the sun starts to go down. One of the townsmen comes in from work, and he says to the man, where are you going to stay? The man says, I have no place to stay. You are welcome in my home. Please come. Has anybody here read the book by Marcus Luttrell, Lone Survivor?
Yes.
A few of you, yeah. That's the story of SEAL Team 10 that had one single survivor off of Operation Red Wing in Afghanistan. It's a harrowing tale, how that they were chased by a much larger force of Taliban than they had expected, and they were picked off one at a time. And Marcus is running, he's wounded, he's just about on the verge of death. He's got a hand grenade in his hand with the pin already pulled, so that if he lets go, it's going to blow up. And he falls down this cliff, and some natives, some Afghanistani natives see him, and they take pity on him, and they pick him up, and they carry him to the village. Well, once he's in the village, the tradition of hospitality takes over, and every man in that village would fight to the death to prevent the Taliban from getting to him. And that's how he survived. Isn't that an amazing story? If you ever get a chance to read it, it's a good one. And it tells you about that tradition of hospitality. Carol Ann reminded me about the Proverbs 31 section that talks about the virtuous woman. And one of the things that it says is, her lamp does not go out at night. Okay, so she leaves the light on. Security. I leave lights on for security. No. In that day, it meant something a little different. If you kept a lantern lit outside the door of your house, what that meant was any travelers coming by were welcome, and they could come and knock on your door, and they would receive shelter and sustenance because of hospitality. And I thought, well, that's a good thing to mention to our class, because we need to exercise hospitality. There's a verse in the New Testament that said, practice hospitality. I'll go look it up. And I went and I looked up hospitality in the New Testament. I found 10 references. It's a much more important thing, I think, than we give credit. And these are poor people who didn't have much at all. We Westerners, we live in these big, beautiful houses. How quick are we to open our house to other people, people we know, people in our church, good people, let alone wayfaring strangers? And I'm convicted at that. I don't think I would take a homeless person into my house. I'm a little afraid of that. And I'm not so sure that's a good thing. Wouldn't it be good if we learned how to practice hospitality as a witness to the world? I remember Robert Schuring, dentist, Ted and Bonnie's son and his wife, or son-in-law and his wife, and their kids went over to India. And they rented a house in an upscale neighborhood because they wanted to evangelize that neighborhood. And you know how they did it? They went from door to door. They decided to have a Christmas party, and they offered to open their home to people in that neighborhood. Would you like to come and hear about Christmas and have a Christmas party with us? We get to know you. The people in the neighborhood were gobsmacked. They had no idea. They'd never seen that because people don't share their home in that culture. What a good thing that we share the hospitality as God commands us to do it. So anyway, let's pick it up on verses 4 and 5 here, Jack.
So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child.
Now, as the head of the home, of the family, he would have to go to Bethlehem to register because his ancestry was from David. Now, why does that matter? Let's look at it this way. Mary was of the lineage of David. Matthew tells us that, okay? And that's the bloodline to Jesus. Joseph wasn't. Joseph wasn't involved in that transaction, was he? So why does Joseph have to be of the line of David? Why was that important? Huh? Prophecy of what?
Of where Jesus would come from.
That's right. If he had been born in Scranton, right? Caesar Augustus would have had him go to Scranton to register for taxes. And Jesus couldn't be born in Bethlehem. So, and that reason alone, Joseph had to be of the lineage of David so that that prophecy in Micah 5 could be fulfilled. But there's another reason. And anybody know what that might be? His legal right, Jesus' legal right to the throne, passes through the Father. And if you go to Luke's genealogy, which we'll touch on in a couple of weeks, there are no women mentioned in the whole thing. It's only the male line. And at the end, he said, Joseph is the father of Heli, and then so forth, works his way down to David. So Joseph was the father of Jesus as far as the law was concerned. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because he would have been on the registry of the local parish church in Nazareth that he was Joseph's son. Or he may have adopted him, but I doubt it. I think he was just registered as Joseph's son. He was legally Joseph's son, even though he was not his blood son. Nobody necessarily knew that. Yeah.
Well, Joseph came through David and Bathsheba's son Solomon, which gave him the king right.
Mm-hmm.
Mary came through Nathan, who was the son right before Solomon, also from David and David and Bathsheba, but not in the kingly line.
That's right. Yeah. So that was Jesus' claim is double. He's David's heir by blood. He's also David's heir by right to the throne, because he was thought by the public to be Joseph's son. Now that brings up something that puzzles me. How did they avoid scandal? I mean, remember, Mary is pregnant. She's been up to see Elizabeth for 3 months. And she's at least 2, maybe 3 months pregnant. And probably not showing, as you ladies explained to me last week. Not showing. She's coming back to Nazareth, but pretty soon it's going to become obvious, isn't it? this woman is pregnant. She has had a sexual relationship outside of her marriage. And the law of Moses says that she should be stoned because that's adultery, even though she was only engaged. So how did they avoid scandal?
They did avoid scandal. I'm sure they were persecuted for that.
Well, Jesus was raised in Nazareth as a normal, they say he's the carpenter's son. It doesn't look to me like there was a tremendous scandal. There's a lot of suspicion.
Well, and certainly in John, they accuse him of being illegitimate.
Exactly. Okay, so let me see if I can paint a picture for you there. Yeah,
Yeah, I have a question.
yeah.
You said that that was the law of Moses, that she be stoned. And how can that be the law of Moses? It wasn't God's law that she be stoned.
Yeah. I don't think I can give you the reference off the top of my head. Well, let's look at it this way. When the Pharisees brought the woman taken in adultery in the very act, and they threw her on the ground in front of Jesus, what did they say? The law requires that this woman be stoned.
Wasn't it man's law, not?
No,
It was.
it's a law given to Moses by God for the nation. Now, we can get into a lot of discussion about the moral law, the national law, and the ceremonial law, but this would be part of their law as a nation. And that law would have evolved over time based on the Sanhedrin. But yeah, it's written in the law of Moses that the woman taken in adultery should be stoned. And Jesus showed mercy by saying, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. Yes, Gigi.
In Deuteronomy 22, it says, it's talking about the man, but I'm sure it's for the woman as well. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, even with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death.
That's right. Well, so let's not dwell on that because we got a long way to go. But I want to give you, there's some ambiguity, and this may be interesting to you, in the way that they look at this marriage, okay? For example, in Luke 1:27, Gabriel goes to Mary, and it says that Mary is a virgin pledged to be married to Joseph. Okay, that's her initial state. Well, after Joseph learns that she's pregnant and he's wrestling with the question, in Matthew 1, verse 19, the angel comes to him and it says, comes to Joseph, her husband. Oh, well, wait a minute. I thought they were just engaged. No, it says her husband. And then about 14 verses later, it says that after he woke up, he took Mary home as his wife. So he wasn't married when the angel appeared to him, but he didn't consummate the marriage until Jesus was born. And then now we see in Luke chapter 2, he's coming down, she's in close to term, and it says Mary, who was pledged to be married. Well, which is it? Now there's an interesting way that you can square the circle on this. Let me see if I can explain it to you. In those days, there was marriage was a two-stage operation. It was much more than the old thing where you give the ring and you're going to be engaged and you break it off, you give the ring back, right? It's not that big a deal, but in betrothal contract, it was a legal matter. It was a whole lot more than two people's romance. Oh, it's a big deal. I'm not saying. Okay.
You said you don't have to give the ring back. You keep it.
You keep the ring. Oh, boy. Anyway, you have a contract, a young man, and sometimes these are children, a young man and his family contract with the girl and her family to say, I will marry this girl. Now, what that does is that gives them both security. Okay, that means that he has an obligation. He will be a father, he will be a husband, and he has a dowry that he receives because the girl's inheritance is her dowry and goes with her. Well, that's good. For the girl, there's an advantage too, because now she knows she is going to be respectable. She's going to be married. She's going to be able to have children. She has someone who will care for her and defend her. This is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And this period of time that they go through betrothal, they are called husband and wife. Husband and wife. And however, they may not live together, nor may they consummate the marriage and have legitimate children. Okay, so the betrothal contract, if it's broken, the young man has to pay a hefty fine and has to go through a legal divorce. And one scholar calculated it out in modern terms, and he said that for a young laborer like Joseph, that would be something on the order of $24,000. So, you know, he's got to be careful when you do that. So you enter into this contract, it's very binding. You are called husband and wife, but you may not live together and you may not have children. But now here it says Mary was pledged to be married, who was expecting a child. So which is it? Well, there's a second ceremony called the taking home ceremony. Those are the Hebrew words, if you're interested. And that is where, when it comes time for the two to come together, the woman is taken in lots of celebration and ceremony and pomp and circumstance to the home of the husband to be. And there's a ceremony, they have a wedding, and then they have the big marriage supper, right? Jesus went to a marriage supper like that in Cana. And you and I are anticipating the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven, aren't we? So there's a big celebration. That's the reception. That's what we call it. Okay. And then from that time on, they are husband and wife, and they are able to live together respectably and have legitimate children. Okay. So here's how this thing worked out. The fact that Mary was pregnant in between says she would be considered an adulterer, because nobody understands what God has been doing in this. They would just assume, they go, who's that guy Gabriel anyway, you know? And so they when they got back from Elizabeth, from the visit to Elizabeth, I think they moved the wedding up. And they decided to have it right away. That was when the angel said to Joseph, go ahead, take this woman to be your wife and all the other stuff. And so he says, when he woke up, he went and he took Mary home to be his wife. So they had the second ceremony while she was probably 3 months pregnant. Nobody knew necessarily that she was pregnant. So now they're legitimately married and they're going to be able to have children. 2 months, 3 months later, what happens? Well, she begins to show, right? Now you could say, oh, maybe that they got a little jump on the pastor there. This may have been a scandal, right? But on the other hand, maybe she's just one of those gals that carries it out in front like a shopping cart, and you know, she's just going to show early. There are girls like that. So, you know, in the eyes of the public, well, she's legit. But I don't know about that. And the tongues would wag, wouldn't they? But they couldn't do anything about it. You couldn't accuse her until the baby was born. And I can just see some wily little gossip in the back saying to her friend, saying, you know what? If that baby's born one day more than 7 months from the wedding, I tell you what, I'll eat my hat. I can just see that, right? So they got a problem, but at least it's been held off for a while. And now Caesar Augustus steps in and he solves the problem, because he forces them to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem, 75 miles away, which might as well be 1,000,000 miles away. And Joseph didn't have to take Mary. He could have gone down there like on a business trip, registered, and come right back. But he took Mary. Why? This was the opportunity to get Mary out of town, and nobody would necessarily know exactly when the baby was born. In fact, they wouldn't come back till some 3, maybe 4 years later after their trip to Egypt. And they come back to Nazareth. Now maybe they have another child or two. Now, Mary and Joseph, they got a family. Nobody remembers all that. But that woman is still sitting back there saying, I'm telling you, that baby's not right. But he was able then to be registered as Joseph's son. Of course he is. And he was raised as a normal child of Mary and Joseph, with suspicions lurking in the background. And that's why we see, as Len said, later on when Jesus was in the ministry, they threw the accusation at him. They said, we are not born of fornication. And that story was going to hound Mary and hound Jesus for the rest of their lives. But it would save them from the immediate scandal and the punishment for adultery that might have been ascribed to Mary. See how God takes care of us? You know, God fingered the greatest power in the world. Caesar Augustus said, I need you to move these people out of Nazareth so I can give them a child without any trouble. And he obediently obeyed. Isn't that great? So God takes care of us in those ways. And I just thought Jesus is born. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And of course, we talked a little bit about that last week. In a stable, it's not necessarily the stable you see, the little wooden stable out on the hill in the middle of nowhere in the star and all those beautiful romantic things. It's probably a relative's house, but when they get there, let's say they get there late at night, they're dead tired. They're going to stay with some third cousin. The guest room's already occupied. There's another member of the family or several people are living in that room. Now that's one of the two rooms on the upper level, the main room where everybody lives and the guest room. And on the lower level, either in the basement or the first floor, were the animals and storage. And I can just see they get there and old sixth cousin Jacob, and they say, we're here, Jacob. And he say, I can't, the room's full. I'll put you guys up in the stable. We'll put some new hay in there and you can rest down there until a couple days this thing gets sorted out. We'll get you a better place to stay. I think that may be how it happened. So, okay, if you're Joseph, you say, dear Lord, couldn't you have provided a room? This has been a bad enough situation for us. And then Mary says, I think I'm going into labor. Middle of the night. I know about that. My first son was born. My wife went into labor at 11 o'clock that night. And I missed my tea time the next day. I would never forgiven her for that. Okay, so anyway, they're going to be down there in that basement with the animals, and then this baby comes in. Wouldn't Joseph have doubted God's wisdom and goodness? God, do you love us? Do you care about this? Is your son? Why would you? We come here late at night. There's no place. We gotta be down in the stables, and now this baby's going to come like right now. I imagine he thought that, don't you? What was God doing? He was crafting a story that will move people's hearts for thousands and thousands of years. What makes Jesus' story so wonderful? These strange things that happen. A baby, the Son of God, born of a virgin, away from home, in a stable, the poorest of the poor. And then you got shepherds, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Everything that God does in these stories has a significance, and it has an implication. What's the implication of being born in a stable? God, the Son of God, is born and identifies with the poorest of the poor. And that's a theme we've seen in the Bible over and over again. God lifts up the humble and he casts down the proud. So God is identifying and with the poorest. And here, Jesus, he sanctifies the poor. He sanctifies the animals even. I mean, there's just so much that's connected with this when you see it. Great implication. And then there's more. Now, this is a picture of today. This is Shepherd's Field. Actually, the shrine or the chapel is behind the camera, okay? And it's very beautiful. It's all manicured. But these are the hills on which the shepherds would have tended their sheep. This is obviously modern earth-moving construction. That road obviously is new. We don't know what the topography was like, what the grass was like, what the trees. It's 2,000 years ago. But you could see how Bethlehem is not that far away. They could have walked over to Bethlehem pretty quickly, okay? And so they think this is where it was that the shepherds were watching their flock. So let's read it, 2:8-10, Jack.
And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people.
Now, it says an angel appeared, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, not just him, round about all of them. So this lit up the whole place. And it said, with the glory of the Lord. What is glory? Have you ever just sat down and thought about that for a minute? What is glory? Just if you really want a great message on glory, our own Tony and Karen Ford's son, Matt, did a sermon on that about the early September. And you can get it at Fountain of Life website. I'll give it to you if you ask for it later. called To God Be the Glory. It's fantastic. It goes way beyond what we can talk about here. So I want to give him credit for some of these thoughts. But anyway, glory has two aspects to it. First one is heaviness, or what we might say, gravitas. What's gravitas? What is that?
It grabs you.
It grabs you? Okay. We used to say that Dick Cheney had gravitas, right? And then Gene Boyce, Vice President of the United States. Let me give you, yeah,
It's a kind of dignity.
dignity, okay. This is, when we get going in this, if you start thinking about this, you will burn your circuits out because it takes a lot, it just takes in so much, okay? Give me an example. Queen Elizabeth II's funeral was attended by some 500 heads of state or representatives of heads of state. It was a major event. She had a grandson, Harry, Prince Harry, who is famous as well, right? I mean, we all know who Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are, and they're in the news occasionally. Which one has gravitas? Of course, it's the Queen, right? Heaviness. Glory is an attribute or that which has substance, importance, that which inspires awe, fear, reverence. Glory is an attribute of that which is holy, precious, the most wonderful. See, you can't get enough words to make it happen. You know, God is glorious in the fact that he is the most important and substantive thing that there is. Give me an example. The power of God in creation displays his glory. Psalm 19 says the heavens declare your glory, right? It's not that the heavens are your glory, they declare your glory. They tell us all that you are very important. You don't mess with God. His power is mighty. The cross is a fascinating, this was the subject of Matt's sermon, and I didn't think of this before, but Jesus is very troubled as he's approaching the cross, and he says this, John 12, 27, 28.
Now my heart is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again.
Jesus then will glorify God by going to the cross. The love of God is so substantial and important that it is part of his glory. See? Now, there's another aspect to it besides heaviness and substance, and that is light. Everywhere we hear the glory of God, it almost always has something to do with light, radiance, majesty, beauty. Now, Matt dwells on beauty a bit, which is a wonderful thought. When you see something that is surpassingly beautiful, it gives you a kind of ache of desire in your heart because that is what you would want. It says that we, in beholding the face of God, we are transformed from glory to glory. We gain glory just by looking at the Lord. The Bible says in 1 Timothy, who God is alone, immortal, who lives in unapproachable light. His first words in creation are, first words God ever spoke, let there be light. Let there be light. The city of God is described in Revelation 21:23.
The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp.
Isn't that interesting? The sun doesn't light the city of God, the glory of God lights it. Now that actually harks back to creation because God created the heavens and the earth, that's space, mass, and time. The earth was waste and void, and he said, let there be light. And then there was a spinning earth, and there was night, and there was day, the first day, right? Sun wasn't there yet. That doesn't come till day 4. Where would that light come from? It's from the glory of God, you see? The glory of God is always associated with light. In specific instances where anybody saw an epiphany or saw God in some way, the prominent features, like, for example, the transfiguration, Jesus' face, Matthew tells us, shone like the sun. And Luke tells us his clothes became bright as a flash of lightning. I like to think of a welder's torch. You ever look at a welder's torch? Don't look at it for long, right? Or a magnesium fire or the sun. Even in the eclipse, that radiation from the sun can burn your retina. So you don't look at it. Paul's encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road, a massive light, and what happened to him? Fell off his horse, was blinded. Then you have John's vision of the risen Christ. I love this one, Revelation 1:16.
In his right hand, he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance.
Okay, so in all these instances that we see throughout the Bible where they see the glory of God or this light, it engenders great fear. Okay, in the shepherds' fields, they were terrified. But when the angel dispels the fear and says, don't be afraid, which very often that's what they have to say. Don't be afraid. I've got good news, which shall be to all people. And then they are filled with joy. And they turn and they glorify God. They experience the glory of God. They turn around with joy and they glorify him, attribute to him glory because of his greatness. Now, one thing Matt said that I really liked, we are by nature glorifiers. You know that? We are. What's the chief end of man? All you catechism buffs?
You know, God and glorify him.
To glorify God and enjoy him forever. Is that one that I'm pointing correctly? Westminster? Yeah. The chief end of man is to glorify God. We are glorifiers. And the problem with us is that we tend to glorify that which is not God. We spend a lot of our time glorifying ourselves through achievement. We want people to recognize. They will glorify us when they recognize the substance of our achievement. Even though our achievement is impossible without the mercy and grace of God giving us the skills and talents he's given us. Right? Our sin, I think, is to glorify anything more than God. Always to remember that whatever your achievements, whatever your gifts, whatever God has bestowed upon you is at his mercy by his grace, and you should reflect that glory back to him because he is glorious. And I think the other thing that comes out of this is that joy comes when we experience God's glory and then turn right around and reflect it back to him. They left the spot where the baby was and they went glorifying God and praising him. Now, note a couple things about this. It was the place right up here on these hills where the temple lambs were grazing. All right. Now, if you were a carpenter or you were a cobbler and you went to Jerusalem for Passover, you needed a lamb. You didn't have one. So you would buy one. And of course, the temple authorities would gouge you like crazy because you didn't bring one, you had to buy one. And these are the lambs that you would buy, and they would be made for sacrifice, okay? And think about it for a minute. Isn't it fitting that the shepherds who attend the temple lambs for sacrifice are the ones who attend the Lamb of God, who is our sacrifice? See the significance, these implications that come from every aspect of the story. It's just fitting that those who attend the temple lambs were the first to attend the Lamb of God. Another thing, there's so many things come out of this. With the shepherds and the magi, that's going to come later, we have bookends, you see. What are those bookends? Well, the shepherds were the poorest, and they were the lowest in status. They were actually despised in many ways. They could not give testimony in court, by the way, okay? So they represent the lowest and the despised, the outsiders. And the magi were the highest, the richest, and the ones with the greatest status. Isn't that interesting? He is saying that God has come for you no matter whether you're poor or rich, whether you're in or out. It's a universal message of salvation, right? Now, it's interesting too, that the shepherds were first. The Magi came quite a bit later. What's that tell you?
Last shall be first and the first shall be last.
Well, you look at it that way. Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. What sort of people are the more responsive to the gospel message, the poor or the rich?
The more.
Why is that?
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily so on that situation, because the Magi responded immediately. It just took them a while.
The Magi is true. But what we're seeing is, what's the symbolism of the fact that the Holy Child, the Messiah who was born, was attended by the poorest of the poor and the outcast, and also by the richest of the rich. And the rich came after the poor. And I think the symbolism is that in general, the more reluctant to come to the gospel are the rich, the powerful, the people who have status. The poor are much quicker to respond to the gospel. Why? Because they know they're poor. Right. We have needs, and we're willing to listen. That, I think, is one of the reasons that Jesus did most of his preaching in rural flyover country. Those people were poorer. They were open to the gospel. Queen Victoria is said, I don't know if this is really true, she was said to have said in that verse, not many righteous, not many noble are called. She says, I am grateful for the letter M, because if it were not any righteous, not any wise, not any noble, not any rich, she said, I'd be locked out.
Mark, there is also a lesson here that both the poor and the rich seek and need God.
Mm-hmm.
You take Queen Elizabeth, for example. Who led her to Christ? Billy Graham.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Graham used to sit with her and talk with her, and he led her to Christ. And he was not intimidated by her wealth or her power.
The land is level at the cross.
Yeah,
I've
that's
heard that
exactly right.
before. The ground is
Exactly
level.
right. But the other thing I think is really important is if you really study the glory of God in the Old Testament and New Testament, anytime someone comes into the presence of the glory of God, they typically fall on their face. If anybody from Solomon all the way up to Peter, James, and John, they wound up on their face. Why? Because I think God's glory is not just beauty, it's scary. What did Isaiah say when he came into the presence of God's glory? Oh, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips. And so I think there is more than just beauty associated with it. There's fear, there's power, and I think people fall on their face in the presence of God's glory because there's a weight upon them that forces them.
That's the idea of heaviness.
Yeah.
That's that idea of substance, of importance, of what makes you fear. Okay.
When I became aware of that, in a personal experience, but also as I read it, it made me aware of why everybody at some time in the future, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. And they'll come into the presence of his glory.
Okay. So one other thing that I want to make, one other point I want to make regarding the rich and the poor. 1 Corinthians 1:26, Jack.
Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth.
That's the verse I was talking about with Queen Victoria. Not many or not any. She was grateful it was not many, because that would have locked her out. One other thing I want to add, that verse that says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. We all think about, my goodness, on the eye of the needle, great big camel. That is really a miracle. Well, it is. But there's another way to look at that. You remember the old cities of the ancient world, they were all walled. They had big walls around them, and their gates were huge. I mean, the entrances were quite large, and they had huge doors. And those doors would be opened in the morning and they would be closed at night. And after a certain time, you could not get them to open those doors. Well, what happens if you're a merchant and you got a camel loaded with some valuables and you're coming in, you got delayed, and you got to get in? Well, there is a small door, about the size of one of our doors, a little shorter, okay, that is in the big door that you can open readily, and the guards will open that for you. And in order for a merchant to get in there, he has, I don't know if you've seen camels do this, but they get down on their knees. They get down on their knees, and they have to scoot them through that little door Can you imagine that's hard work, right? You might have to help them out. You go, "Drag them out, let's go." And you would do that because you're in danger outside the walls. You are in danger. And so you come and you humble yourself, you get on your knees, and you go in through needle's eye. Now, does that make that mean a little more? It's easier for a rich man to enter the kingdom, easier for a camel to go through needle's eye than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. It's an interesting interpretation of that passage. Anyway, move on. We come to the next passage, which is Luke 2:22.
When the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord.
Okay, Mary and Joseph were going to comply with Moses' laws of purification. Okay, you couldn't go into the temple unless you were ceremonially clean. It was a big deal for them. And so they went in accordance with Leviticus chapter 12. And I won't read it, but you can read. It's about 8-10 verses. And it tells what you must do after you've been birthed to a girl. And so this is not the circumcision of the child. I used to think that. You think we brought the child at 8 days to the temple to be circumcised. No, that would have been done at home in their village in Bethlehem by a mohel. They're called a mohel. It's what they do. They're experts in how to do this thing. And so he would have already been circumcised. This is 40 days after the birth. And it was to confirm by the priests that this woman is now purified of her bleeding and all the things that go with childbirth, and she is able to enter into the fellowship of the temple. So that's her purification is the first thing. But then there's another aspect of it, is she is there to consecrate her firstborn son. Now, why is that done? Well, you go back to Exodus chapter 13, and that is when they're just leaving. Chapter 12 is the Passover, and then the firstborn is killed throughout the land of Egypt by the angel of death. The firstborn of the Jews, if they had the blood on the door lintel, would be saved and would be spared. And God says, because of that, every firstborn belongs to me. You must give that firstborn to me, or you must redeem it. And the price of redeeming that child was a lamb. Or if you were poor, you could do it with 2 birds, 2 doves, 2 pigeons, whatever. And of course, that's what Mary and Joseph provided, was the 2 doves. And I'm just going to pass on Exodus 13 too. And so they're at the temple going through this rite of purification, and they meet this guy named Simeon. Simeon's an old man. He'd been told, verse 26, that he would not die before he had seen the Messiah. Now, he's just like everybody else in that time. He had been reading the book of Daniel. He could count as well as anybody else, and we've done this in our class before. And so he knew that at this point in time, they at least were in the frame. Messiah should show up at this point. And he's looking for Messiah along with a lot of other people. So the Holy Spirit moves him to go into the temple, and he voices a hymn. This hymn is usually sung at Candlemas. Candlemas is this period, this 40 days after the birth of Christ, after Christmas. And the hymn goes like this, Jack.
We'll see if I can get through it. It's rare for me to get through it without getting emotional. But Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel."
And that's a hymn that's been used in Christian churches for centuries. Now, he's reflecting prophecies. Remember, he didn't have a New Testament. He didn't have the Gospel of Luke. He had nothing but the Old Testament Tanakh. That's the law, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. And he is reflecting prophecies in Isaiah. Let's listen to Isaiah chapter 42, 6 and 7. And I want you to just, if you remember that time when Jesus went to Nazareth to the synagogue for the first time, and he opened up the book of Isaiah and he said, this day this is fulfilled. You know that story? All right, we're gonna compare. Go ahead, Isaiah 42, 6 to 7.
I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness.
I love that. To open the eyes of the blind, to free captives from prison, to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. And there's so much in there. Now, Jesus, 20 some years later, he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth. He sits down. They give him the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads Isaiah 61:1. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim freedom to the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he said, this day, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. You see that the comparison, that the language is so similar, talking about freedom for the captives, release from darkness for prisoners. Also, you have in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, it says, for those who are dwelling in the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. And those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And you just go down through some more verses and you come to the one that really is our Christmas verse. For unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given. The government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of Yahweh Almighty will accomplish this. Wow. Wow. You can go to Isaiah 49, verse 6. Jack, let's read that one too.
He says, is it too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept? I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth.
Wow. This is a universal claim, isn't it? You see, all these verses talk about a light to the Gentiles. And I think this one is especially important because it says, speaking to Messiah, you will restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel that I have kept. Elijah was on Mount Sinai and the Lord spoke to him after Elijah pouted and said, I'm the only one left and they're trying to kill me. And the Lord says, oh no, I have kept for myself 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. There is in Israel a remnant. And I believe that remnant is growing today, especially with all of the trouble and the war and things that are surrounding them. He will bring back those of Israel that I have kept, but I will also make you a light to the Gentiles. Wow, the salvation to all peoples of the earth. This fulfills the promise to Abraham. And in you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Wow. That's a universal claim. And this puts him on a collision course with the temple authorities and the religious leaders of Israel, because they were of the opinion that you could not find God's favor and be saved apart from becoming a Jew. And so we'll see that unfold as time goes on. But then, verses 34 and 35, he turns and he speaks directly to Mary. It's up there, okay? And he warns her there's trouble ahead. Cause for the falling and rising of many in Israel. He's going to be consequential. He's going to make a big difference. And to be a sign that will be spoken against, the word in there is the word for a target that you shoot at. He will have opposition. And he will penetrate. The thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. He'll penetrate to the thoughts of your heart. Isn't that what the gospel does? The gospel is not nearly so much concerned about whether you smoke, drink, or chew, or have no truck with them to do. The Bible is concerned with what's going on in your heart. And that's where Jesus penetrates. But then he says to her, and a sword will pierce your own soul. She would experience a deep and painful grief that we cannot understand. She's had all the grief of the suspicion and the aspersions that have been cast upon her for adultery because of this baby. She's always had somebody with a little bit of a doubt in her mind. She's going to see her baby up on the cross. And the sword will pierce her own soul. Then we learn about the prophetess Anna. I don't want to dwell on Anna except for one thing. It says in Luke, here we go. There was a prophetess Anna, daughter Penuel. It tells us a lot about her. Don't ask me why. She was married for 7 years, and then she was widowed for 84 years. She's an old lady. She's either 84 years old or she's been like, she's close to 100. She's a very old lady. She spends all of her time in the temple, fasting, praising God, waiting for Messiah. That's the key. And it says she sees the child, she glorifies God, and then she goes everywhere. She's the first evangelist. And she seeks out people and she tells them about this child. But the interesting thing is that the verse says, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. You see, God will speak to you if you're willing to hear, if you're listening for his voice. He will give you the gospel if you are open to it. And so she went around and did that. That was her audience. So now, Matthew gives us the next step. We can't spend a lot of time. We've already had a lot of good things said about Matthew. We have now the visit of the Magi. That's where we're going to be here. They come from up north, probably from Babylon and Persia, which is northeast rather. And this is a group of people, not necessarily three. They too had read the prophecies of Daniel. And they saw the star and they put two and two together and they said, we need to go see this king that's prophesied. Well, they would have had to mount an expedition. You don't go 800, 1,000 miles on foot without mounting an expedition. You need to have supplies. You need to have soldiers to guard you. Okay. I think it was a pretty large caravan and it was pretty significant. It wasn't just three guys in the middle of the desert. Okay. And they came, and I imagine that they tried to combine it with business so that they stopped in all the major cities along the way. So by the time they got to Bethlehem, it's been a good year, maybe a little more. And they are able to command an audience with King Herod. So they're pretty important dudes. I mean, this is a major event. And this huge caravan comes into Jerusalem, and they get an audience with the king, and they say, we're here to see the king of the Jews. We've seen the star. Well, Herod's a wily old guy. He's slaughtered enough of his own family. He saw everybody was a threat to his throne. And so he said, well, go ahead. It's in Bethlehem. The prophets tell us that. Go to Bethlehem and come let me know where he is. I'd like to go worship him myself. You know, of course, then they go and the Lord appears to them in a dream and says, you don't want to go back through Jerusalem. Find a different way out. When they came down here, they came down the Jordan Valley, probably went up the Jericho Road, which is the way you went to Jerusalem. Okay. And so now they're going to go a different way. And they're going to go back by the King's Highway, let's say. I'm imagining, but that works. And I think that there were spies in Bethlehem from Herod, and they reported immediately back to Herod. Herod, these guys have left, but they're not coming back to Jerusalem. They're going a different way. Herod picks it up right away, and he realizes, okay, I'll show you. And he's furious. And he orders a detail immediately to go to Bethlehem and kill all the babies 2 years and younger. All the boys. So then we get this picture of Joseph being warned. Matthew 2, 13, 15.
When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where they stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son.
This is very interesting to me because I think there was real urgency in here, okay? Joseph says to Mary, wake up. It says he got up, middle of the night. He got up, wake up, get the baby. Get Jesus, here, pick him up, pack everything in this bag. Let's go, we got to get out of here. And they left in the middle of the night. And they fled south toward Egypt. And they spend a year, 2 years, 3 years living in Egypt. Now they would have had the proceeds from the gifts that were brought to them to live on, okay? He could have certainly worked with construction. But they stayed down there until a time came that they should come back. And so now we're at the return to Nazareth, which both Luke and Matthew covered. Okay, but he's coming back to a different world. Herod is dead, and we're gonna flip through this pretty quick. He had 3 sons in his will to whom he gave his kingdom. They fought over it, and it was Augustus, or Tiberius rather, the Roman emperor, who decided the story, and he partitioned the kingdom of Herod into 3 parts. And he had 3 sons. One was Herod Philip, who got Gaulonitis. Sometimes you see Trachonitis and a whole bunch of other little areas. But basically, this is the Golden Heights that we see under siege right now, okay? And up here is Caesarea Philippi. He built his capital on top of an ancient pagan site, grotto, that was called the Gates of Hell. And that's where Peter made his confession, and Jesus said, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Why do they call it the gates of hell? Because centuries earlier, it was believed that Baal and his consort Asherah in the fall would go through that grotto down to the place of the dead, which they called hell. And they would stay there in the winter while everything was dead. And then in the spring, they would be coaxed out, and they would come out, and they would bring fertility and life to the world. So that's called the gates of hell. And that's what Jesus said, the gates of hell will not prevail against. Up to the north, he also ruled Mount Hermon up here, okay? And that's where the transfiguration took place, we think. He also built a city for a winter palace down at Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida is important because Peter, Andrew, and Philip were all from Bethsaida. And it was a fishing village, and Philip built his winter palace down there. And that is probably just across the Jordan from there, was where Jesus fed the 5,000. So that's Philip. A lot was done in his area. Mostly Gentiles, very few Jews. And then you had Antipas. Antipas got out Galilee and Perea. This is flyover country, mostly rural. Okay, he rebuilt the old city of Sepphoris, which was only like 3 miles away from Nazareth. And so most people think that Jesus and Joseph every day would have walked 3 miles over to Sepphoris, and they would help build the city, the glorious capital city for Herod Antipas. And then after he was done with that one, he built a second capital city, Tiberias, which was a purely Gentile city. It was built on a cemetery. And that's today where you would stay if you went to the Galilee, more than likely. It's a lovely town. And so that was part of Herod Antipas's world. Most of Jesus' preaching and teaching took place in Antipas's domain. And the reason was Jesus always had trouble down here. This was given to Archelaus. He was called an ethnarch. The bulk of David's old kingdom, the bulk of Herod's kingdom was given, Idumea, Judah, and Samaria, all known as Judea, was given to Archelaus. And the problem with that is it was a hotbed of conflict between Hellenizing Romans and Greeks and Jews and Jewish factions, the Zealots, the Essenes, the corrupt high priesthood. All of that was going on in Judea. Made it a very difficult place for Jesus. And the problem with Archelaus was that he turned out to be a monster. He slaughtered some 3,000 Jews in the temple with whom he had an argument. Okay, and then he banned Passover in Jerusalem. Right as soon as he was inaugurated. And he went on like that for several years. He made life absolutely miserable. And we learn about that in Matthew 2:22. Jack?
But when he, Joseph, heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee.
Here they go. Isn't that cool? Anyway, it's a gadget. So I have a feeling that Joseph was going to go back to Bethlehem. He'd been there for a couple of years, right? He had family there. He was working there, I think, and had a house or something. And, you know, he just had to flee. But that was the nearest place that he would go back to. But he learned about Archelaus. Archelaus was a monster. And so that forced him to go back up to Nazareth where they started from. Remember, it said that he would be prophesied that he would be a Nazarene. But that's what forced him back up to Nazareth. Okay, and that put him outside of Archelaus's jurisdiction. After about 9 years in office and about 2 embassies that were sent by Jews to Rome, the Roman emperor had enough of this guy, and he deposed him, that is, he fired him, and he sent him into exile to France, which in those days was like going to Siberia. I mean, there was nobody up there. And he sent him up there, and that's where he died, and we never hear another thing about him. Then what he did was he reorganized Archelaus's kingdom and he made it a Roman province. Now that has an effect. That means that no longer is a local king going to rule its people, someone with connection to the people that they usually would prefer. Now they're saying, this is important enough, we're going to send a guy from Italy. He's going to be loyal to the emperor. He's a Roman. He's going to spend all his time in Caesarea, and he's got two missions. One, get the taxes collected. Two, keep the peace, suppress any rebellion. And so he was much more disconnected from the people than Herod was. And that means that the temple police and the temple officials in Jerusalem had very wide-ranging powers all throughout Judea. And that's going to figure as Jesus spends time in Judea, he's under a lot of pressure. And that's a dangerous place for him to be. Just one last thing, and that is the Decapolis. That means 10 cities. And what happened was the Greeks and the Romans built 10 showcase cities to introduce Hellenism and all of its culture into the Middle East. And they had a league called the Decapolis, which was subject, along with all these other kingdoms, to the governor of Syria. That was the Roman governor who had the legions and had the power, okay? So that's the Decapolis. Jesus spent a good deal of time here, okay? So we'll see that Jesus did some work in the Red Kingdom here when he was starting, but then most of his time was in Galilee and up north and in the Gentile countries and in Perea before he was crucified. Okay, last thing. Now, Joseph and Mary take Jesus down and he visits the temple when he's 12 years old, and we come to the end of the prequel. Not much to say there. Luke is the only one to get this story to us, and it's very familiar. It's chapter 2, verses 44 to 46.
Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions.
Now, David Guzik tells us that for the Passover season, it was the custom for the Sanhedrin to meet in public in the temple court to discuss in the presence of all who would listen religious and theological questions. So that was actually an opportunity for Jesus to sit and listen, ask questions. It was actually a regular practice that they had in those days. But think about this. They're traveling for a day before they realize that he's gone. They're coming back a day. He spent 3 days looking for him in the city of Jerusalem. He's gone 5 days. You got a 12-year-old child is now missing for 5 days. Now, you mothers, how do you feel about that? You know, it had to be really, really tough to take. My question is, where did he eat? Where did he sleep? I'm going to ask that question when I get there. I just have no idea. But he was able to amaze people with his understanding. And when you understand, the rabbinic learning at the time was incredible because the Jews highly prized scholarship. Now, Jesus did not have the intellect of a man of 30 or 60. He was human in the sense that he developed like a human being. But he had all the intellect as possible for a 12-year-old to have. And at the age of 12, that is when, in Jewish culture, you began to train with your father to assume his trade. If you're a carpenter, you became a carpenter like your father. You're a plumber, you become a plumber like your father. And so Jesus is in his father's house, and he is beginning to train to be his father's representative. Now, Luke 2:48 to 50.
When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them.
Now, I don't understand how they could not understand. Okay? Mary certainly understood that Joseph was not the father of this child, but that the Holy Spirit was. But it's been 12 years. Okay? 12 to 13, depending on pregnancy. And so it must have faded. I mean, they got other children, they got work to do, they got they got all the problems that you have with a young family. And I think maybe it's sort of faded into the background. It's just Jesus is here. He calls Joseph dad. And now Jesus said, didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Have you forgotten, Mary, what Gabriel said to you? Have you forgotten the fact that this child is the Son of God? And it must have brought them back to their senses rather quickly. But nevertheless, he obeys them and he returns back to Nazareth, where he continues to grow up. And Jack, we're going to read what Dave Guzik has to say on that.
Growing up in Nazareth, Jesus would mature in boyhood, and then in his young adulthood, he would fulfill the responsibilities expected of an eldest son. And then at some time, Joseph disappeared from the scene, and Jesus became the man of the family. He worked his trade, supported his family, loved his God, and proved himself utterly faithful in 1,000 small things before he formally entered his appointed ministry.
Jesus demonstrated the maxim that it is required of us that we be faithful in even the little things, that we be subject to legitimate authority, that we do the little tasks that we're given to do, even when they're unimpressive. Very few of us are going to become John the Baptist. Very few of us are going to have a ministry like Billy Graham. But all of us are going to have a mundane set of tasks that we've got to do day in and day out. And the fact that the Lord of life fulfilled and put up with that part of life sanctifies it. It makes it a holy thing. It gives glory back to God. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, he says, so whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. We are glorifiers by nature. We are glorifiers by our mission. And the most important thing is that we glorify the only one who has all the substance to be glorified.